The air at 11,000 feet doesn't just freeze. It strips the moisture from your lungs until every breath tastes like copper and rusted iron. Riley hadn't touched the rifle in 3 days. That was Hutch's job. Her job was the wind, the math, the spin drift, until the mortar shell turned their observation blind into a meat grinder, leaving her commander bleeding out on the shale. 2 miles out, 1 bullet left, just the spotter. There is no glory in Overwatch. The recruitment videos leave out the smell. After 72 hours lying prone under a camouflaged netting in a rocky outcrop in the Caucasus, the hide smelled of stale sweat, chemical hand warmers, and the sealed plastic bags of their own waste. Riley shifted her weight, a millimeter at most. The sharp edge of a buried limestone rock dug mercilessly into her left hip bone through her insulated pants. She didn't move the rock. You don't move the rock. You learn to live with the pain until the nerve endings give up and go numb. Beside her, Commander Tolliver Hutchinson, Hutch to his face, the old man in the barracks, exhaled. A long, slow, rattling sound that meant he was awake, alert, and entirely bored. His eye was pressed to the rubber cup of the customized .416 Barrett. "Wind," Hutch croaked. His voice was a dry rasp. He hadn't drank water in 6 hours to avoid needing to piss. Riley didn't look away from her spotting scope. The glass was high-end, a heavy slab of military-grade optics that condensed the hostile world into a clean, circular fishbowl. "Cross Valley is shifting," Riley said, keeping her voice to a flat, emotionless murmur. She blinked, clearing the sting of the cold from her eyes. "You've got a half-value wind from the left at the peak, 6 knots. But down in the bowl, it's swirling. Thermal updraft." She glanced down at her Kestrel weather meter. The digital numbers shifted sluggishly in the extreme cold. She tapped the tiny screen, her fingers thick and clumsy in the insulated gloves. Temperature, -8. Humidity, 19%. Barometric pressure, plummeting. "Dial in 14.2 mils up," Riley instructed, her brain running the ballistic algorithms she had spent 4 years memorizing until they were a permanent scar on her psyche. "Left 1.4, Hutch's gloved hand moved. 2 dull clicks of the turrets. "Set." Riley was a SEAL. She had survived the surf, the logs, the sleep deprivation, the endless, agonizing slog of BUD/S that was designed to break men twice her size. She had earned the trident pinned to her dress uniform back home. But out here, on this frozen ridge, she wasn't an operator. She was a human calculator. She was the safety net. Hutch was the artist. She just mixed the paint. It was a dynamic she accepted, even if she hated it. The military loved its hierarchies, and Hutch had been putting bullets through targets since Riley was in middle school. He didn't care about the politics of a woman in the teams. He only cared if her math was right. "Target building is quiet," Riley noted. Through the scope, the compound looked like a pile of discarded cinder blocks dumped in the middle of a barren, snow-dusted valley. 3 miles away, their target was Ralph Lawson, an American expat turned broker. He sold things that leveled city blocks to people who didn't care who lived in those blocks. They had tracked him for 6 months, across 3 continents, only to end up freezing on a rock, waiting for him to step outside for a smoke. "He's in there," Hutch muttered. "Cockroaches always stay near the heat." Riley rubbed her nose against her scarf. It was crusted with frozen condensation from her own breath. Her toes were completely devoid of sensation. She wiggled them inside her boots, feeling nothing but a vague, distant pressure. Hypothermia was a creeping, insidious thing. It didn't announce itself. It just made you tired, and then it made you dead. If he doesn't move before the sun drops behind the ridge, we lose our contrast, Riley said. He'll move, Hutch replied. His tone was infuriatingly calm. It was the tone of a man who had left a wife and 3 kids in Coronado to come lie in the dirt, and felt completely at peace with the transaction. Riley went back to the glass. She watched a stray dog pick its way through the trash outside the compound's perimeter wall. She watched the dust blow across the hardened mud. She measured the speed of the dust, 3 miles per hour. Full value. She felt the familiar, hollow ache in her stomach. The boredom was worse than the terror. Terror was chemical. It flooded your system, made your pupils dilate, made you feel impossibly alive. Boredom just ate away at your sanity, leaving you with nothing but your own thoughts and the agonizing realization of how small you were in the grand, indifferent machinery of the world. She adjusted the focus ring. The dog lifted its leg against a rusted oil drum. "Range to the oil drum?" Hutch asked, testing her. 3,200 yards, Riley snapped back instantly. "Don't get cute, Hutch. Save the barrel life." Hutch let out a short, muffled grunt that might have been a laugh. "Just checking, Boyd. Just checking." Riley settled back in. The wind howled over the ridge, a high, lonely sound that stripped away any remaining illusions of heroism. They were just 2 assassins in the dirt, waiting for a ghost. It didn't start with a bang. It started with a shadow. Riley's peripheral vision caught the movement. A flicker, high and to their right. It wasn't down in the valley where Lawson was hiding. It was on the adjacent ridgeline. "Hutch," Riley said, her voice dropping an octave, losing the casual boredom. Before he could answer, the air changed. The pressure dropped so violently that Riley felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her eardrums. The silence of the mountain was suddenly sucked away, replaced by a rushing, tearing sound like a freight train ripping through canvas. The mortar shell hit 20 yards below their hide. There was no fireball, no cinematic slow-motion debris, just a concussive wave of invisible force that physically picked Riley up and slammed her back down onto the shale. The sound came a microsecond later, a deafening, chest-crushing crack that rattled her teeth in her skull. Dirt, snow, and jagged shards of rock rained down on them in a violent, suffocating storm. The camouflaged netting collapsed, burying them in heavy, dust-choked mesh. Riley couldn't breathe. The air had been turned into a suspension of pulverized limestone. She coughed, choking on the grit, tasting blood from where she had bitten her tongue. Her ears were ringing with a high, continuous whine, drowning out all other sound. She scrambled blindly, her hands tearing at the netting. Panic, raw and unrefined, clawed at her throat. She wasn't thinking about training. She wasn't thinking about SEAL ethos. She was a frightened animal trapped under a heavy blanket. She ripped the mesh away, daylight burning her dust-filled eyes. "Hutch!" she screamed. She couldn't hear her own voice. She dragged herself over the loose rocks. The heavy .416 Barrett was still on its bipod, covered in a thick layer of grey dust. Hutch lay beside it. He wasn't moving. Riley crawled to him, her knees scraping raw against the stone. "Hutch, hey, hey!" She grabbed his shoulder and rolled him onto his back. The bottom half of his face was smeared with mud, but it wasn't the mud that made Riley's stomach heave. A jagged piece of shrapnel, the size of a broken dinner plate, was buried deep in his neck and upper chest, right where the Kevlar plate carrier ended and the flesh began. The blood wasn't pumping. It was pouring, thick, dark, and impossibly fast. It smelled sickeningly sweet, a hot, metallic odor that cut right through the freezing air. "Oh, God!" Riley gasped, the sound ragged. Her hands began to shake. The fine motor control she prided herself on vanished. She ripped off her heavy gloves with her teeth, spitting them onto the dirt. She grabbed her trauma kit from her chest rig, her fingers fumbling uselessly with the heavy plastic buckle. Breathe, her brain screamed. Do the checklist. She finally wrenched the kit open and pulled out a roll of quick-clot gauze. She pressed her bare hands into the wound, trying to find the source of the bleeding. The flesh was hot and slippery. Hutch's eyes were wide open, staring up at the grey sky, but they were unfocused, glassy. "Look at me, Tolliver. Look at me," she pleaded, shoving the gauze into the torn muscle. He didn't look at her. His mouth opened, and a wet, gurgling sound bubbled from his throat. Pink froth gathered at the corner of his lips. A lung hit. The shrapnel had severed the artery and punctured the pleural cavity. Riley pressed her entire body weight against his chest, her hands slick with his blood. It was warm, shockingly warm in the freezing cold. It soaked into her sleeves, staining her pale skin dark crimson. She was hyperventilating. The cynical armor she wore, the tough, calculating exterior she projected to survive in a man's world. It all melted away into pure, chaotic terror. She wasn't a Tier 1 operator right now. She was a 28-year-old woman trying to hold a dying man's life inside his body with her bare hands. "Don't do this, man," she whispered, tears cutting clean tracks through the grey dust on her face. "You don't get to check out. I don't know the wind. I don't know the wind." Hutch's hand twitched. His bloody fingers brushed against her wrist. It wasn't a comforting gesture. It was a spasm. He let out one final, ragged breath. A long shudder ran through his massive frame, and then he was perfectly still. The tension left his muscles. He became heavy. He became dead weight. Riley sat there, her hands still pressed to his destroyed neck, the blood already beginning to cool against her skin. The ringing in her ears slowly faded, replaced by the howling of the wind. She stared at him. Her mind simply stopped processing. There was no heroic resolve. There was no internal monologue about vengeance. There was just an overwhelming, nauseating void. She dry heaved, twisting away from him, vomiting a meager stream of stomach acid and water onto the rocks. She wiped her mouth with the back of her trembling, blood-soaked hand. Then a sound cut through the wind. An engine. Riley snapped her head toward the valley. Below, 3 miles away, the heavy steel gates of the compound were swinging open. A convoy of 3 black SUVs was rolling out into the dust. Lawson. The mortar hadn't been a targeted strike. It was covering fire, a distraction. Lawson was leaving. Riley looked down at Hutch. Then she looked at the heavy .416 rifle. It was over. The mission was a catastrophic failure. Doctrine dictated she blow the radio, spike the gun, and exfil immediately. She was a spotter. She was a calculator. She was not the trigger puller. But as she watched the SUVs kick up a trail of brown dust on the valley floor, moving toward the extraction point at the far end of the pass, a cold, violent clarity settled over her. It wasn't patriotism. It wasn't justice. It was pure, unadulterated spite. She wiped her bloody hands on her pants and crawled behind the rifle. The stock of the Barrett was freezing against her cheek. Riley's breathing was jagged, catching in her throat as she pressed her eye to the scope. The smell of Hutch's blood was overpowering, clinging to her skin and clothes, a constant, sickening reminder of the corpse lying less than 2 feet away. Through the reticle, the world was chaotic. The magnification was cranked to maximum. The 3 SUVs were tearing down the dirt road, shrinking rapidly. They were approaching the choke point, a narrow bridge spanning a dry riverbed at the far end of the valley. Riley reached into her rig and pulled out the laser rangefinder. She braced it on a rock, her hands still trembling slightly, and lased the bridge. The red numbers flashed. 3,520 yards, exactly 2 miles. It was an impossible shot. A 3,500-yard shot wasn't marksmanship. It was artillery. It was a statistical anomaly relying on luck as much as skill. The time of flight for the massive .416 bullet would be over 7 seconds. In 7 seconds, the Earth would physically rotate beneath the bullet. The wind would push it, the gravity would pull it, the thin air would friction burn its velocity down to subsonic speeds, causing it to tumble uncontrollably. She dropped the rangefinder and grabbed her Kestrel. She didn't have Hutch to read the mirage. She didn't have a spotter to call the wind across 3 different microclimates in the valley. She was utterly alone. "Think, Boyd," she muttered to herself, her voice a harsh whisper. "Just do the math." She stared down the valley, forcing her panicked brain to compartmentalize. She looked at the dust trails behind the vehicles. She looked at the way the dry brush swayed near the bridge. Zone 1, the ridge. Wind blowing left to right, 8 miles per hour. Zone 2, the valley floor. Wind dead calm, heavy thermal sink. Zone 3, the bridge canyon, a funnel. Wind whipping right to left, 12 miles per hour. She fed the variables into the ballistic solver strapped to her wrist. Range, 3,520. Incline, -4 degrees. Temperature, -8. Spin drift, 1.2 mils right. Coriolis effect, 0.4 mils down, 0.2 right. Aerodynamic jump from the crosswind. The solver spat out a number that made her stomach drop. Elevation, 48.6 mils. The scope didn't even have that much adjustment in the turrets. She would have to dial the elevation to the maximum limit and then physically hold the crosshairs high above the target in the reticle itself. She would be aiming at the sky, dropping the bullet in like a mortar. She reached up with a blood-crusted hand and spun the elevation turret. It clicked heavily, stopping at 30 mils. She was maxed out. She would have to hold the remaining 18.6 mils in the glass. The lead SUV reached the bridge. It didn't cross. It stopped. Riley's heart slammed against her ribs. The convoy was pausing. A checkpoint. Armed men milled around the bridge. The back door of the middle SUV opened. A man stepped out. He wore a heavy tan coat and was lighting a cigarette. Lawson. Through the massive magnification of the scope, the air between them boiled with mirage, making his figure shimmer and dance like a ghost. Riley adjusted the bipod, digging the spiked feet deep into the shale. She wrapped her left arm under the stock, pulling it tight into her shoulder pocket. The rifle felt foreign, too heavy, too long. It wasn't hers. She exhaled, forcing the air out of her lungs. Her breath control was terrible. Her chest was heaving. "Stop it," she ordered herself. "You're just a calculator. Run the numbers." She placed the reticle over Lawson. Then she moved it up, up, far above his head, above the bridge, until he was at the very bottom edge of the scope's field of view, sitting perfectly on the 18.6 mil hash mark. Then she moved it for the wind. Left, 4.2 mils. She was aiming at empty air, high and to the left of the target, trusting that gravity, wind, and the rotation of the planet would somehow drag the chunk of brass and lead down into a man standing 2 miles away. Her finger rested on the curved metal of the trigger. The silence around her was absolute, save for the wind. Hutch was dead. The radio was dead. She was completely isolated on a frozen rock at the top of the world. She closed her eyes for a split second, seeing Hutch's bloody throat. She opened them. The mirage cleared for a fraction of a second. She pressed the trigger. The recoil was a violent physical assault. The rifle bucked hard, slamming into her shoulder with the force of a sledgehammer, kicking up a massive cloud of dust from the muzzle brake. The concussion rocked her skull. She didn't blink. She fought the recoil, dragging the heavy rifle back down, forcing her eye to stay in the scope, fighting through the dust and the pain to track the shot. 1, 2, 3. She counted the seconds in the dark, quiet space of her mind. The bullet was arcing high into the stratosphere, tearing through the thin air, losing speed, fighting the crosswinds. 4, 5, 6. It was going subsonic now. It would be destabilizing. The math was breaking down. 7. Through the scope, 2 miles away, Lawson was turning his head, exhaling a plume of white cigarette smoke. Suddenly, his head simply ceased to be. It was sudden, brutal, and entirely devoid of sound. One frame he was standing there. The next, his upper torso was violently whipped backward against the door of the SUV. A fine pink mist atomizing in the freezing air, vanishing instantly into the wind. A split second later, the men around him panicked, scrambling for cover, pointing rifles at the empty hills, looking for a shooter they could not hear and could not see. Riley stared through the glass for 3 long, agonizing breaths. She watched the panic unfold in absolute silence. She didn't feel a rush of victory. She didn't feel the cold satisfaction of justice. She felt nothing but the profound, crushing emptiness of the valley and the sticky, drying blood on her hands. She pulled her eye away from the scope. She looked at Hutch's body, already dusting over with limestone powder. Slowly, methodically, she reached down, grabbed the radio handset, and pressed the transmit button. "Any station this net? This is Vulture 2, she whispered, her voice cracking. "Target destroyed. Commander down. I need a ride." The radio cracked, a sharp hiss of static that felt offensively loud in the wake of the gunshot. "Vulture 2, this is Overlord. Say again, Commander down." The voice belonged to a 20-something communications officer sitting in an air-conditioned command center in Germany. He sounded confused. He sounded like a man who had just spilled his coffee, not a man who had just been told his Tier 1 asset was bleeding out on a mountain. Riley stared at the handset. Her thumb hovered over the push-to-talk button. The plastic was freezing against her bare skin. The blood on her hands had stopped being a liquid. It was tacky now, turning brown, pulling the skin tight across her knuckles like a bad burn. She pressed the button. "Affirmative, Overlord. Vulture 1 is KIA. Target is neutralized. I am compromised. Requesting immediate extraction at secondary point Alpha." There was a pause. Riley could almost hear the frantic typing on the other end, the shifting of headsets, the sudden hushed panic in a room that smelled of stale ozone and floor wax. "Copy, Vulture 2. Routing QRF. Window is 60 mics. Hold your position." 60 minutes, 1 hour. Riley dropped the handset. It bounced against her chest rig. 60 minutes in -8 degrees without a warming layer, with her core temperature already plummeting from the adrenaline crash. She began to shake. It started in her jaw, a violent chattering that she couldn't clamp down, and quickly spread to her shoulders and core. This wasn't fear anymore. This was physiology. Her hypothalamus was desperately firing signals to her muscles, forcing them to contract and generate heat. She couldn't just sit here. She had to scrub the site. She forced herself to move, pushing up from the dirt. Her knees screamed, stiff and bruised from the mortar blast. She crawled over to the heavy .416 Barrett. The barrel was still radiating a faint, residual heat from the massive cartridge it had just expelled. It was a beautiful piece of machinery, but it weighed 32 pounds. She couldn't carry it down the mountain, and she couldn't leave it for the locals to find. Her hands fumbled with the heavy latches of her assault pack. Her fingers were thick, unresponsive sausages of flesh. She had to use the heel of her palm to shove the zipper open. She dug past her spare ammunition and pulled out a small, grey cylinder. A thermite grenade. She ripped the bolt out of the Barrett and tossed it into the deep crevasse behind their hide. Then she jammed the thermite grenade directly into the empty chamber of the rifle, pulled the pin, and shoved the heavy stock against a rock to keep it upright. She turned her face away and squeezed her eyes shut. The hiss was immediate, followed by a blinding, sputtering white light that threw harsh, jagged shadows against the canyon wall. The heat washed over her face, a brief, glorious wave of warmth. As the thermite burned at 4,000 degrees, melting the hardened steel of the receiver, fusing the chamber into a useless, warped lump of slag. The smell of melting metal and chemical accelerant filled the air, acrid and sharp, overriding the metallic scent of blood. Now came the part she had been avoiding. She turned to Hutch. The grey dust from the mortar strike had settled over him entirely, turning his multicam uniform into the colour of the stones. He looked like a statue left behind by some forgotten civilization. Doctrine was clear. You do not leave a fallen teammate behind. You carry them out, or you die trying. It was the bedrock of the teams. Riley crawled to his side. She grabbed the heavy nylon drag handle stitched into the back of his plate carrier. She planted her boots into the loose shale, leaned back, and pulled with everything she had left. Her boots slipped. She fell hard onto her backside, jarring her spine. Hutch hadn't moved a single inch. She scrambled back up, her breathing turning ragged. "Come on," she whispered, her voice rough. She grabbed the handle again, wrapping the nylon around her wrist for leverage. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the burning in her forearms, and threw her entire body weight backward. A heavy, wet, tearing sound echoed as Hutch's body shifted maybe 2 inches, his boots dragging through the dirt. Riley's left foot gave way on a loose rock, and she collapsed again, her hands tearing open against the jagged limestone. She lay there in the dirt, panting, staring at the sky. It was simple math. Tolliver Hutchinson weighed 220 pounds. His gear, armor, plates, ammo, water, comms, weighed another 50. 270 pounds of dead weight. Riley weighed 140 pounds, soaking wet. The extraction point was a mile down a sheer, treacherous goat path, covered in ice and loose scree. She could not carry him. She could not drag him. If she tried, she would fall off the ridge, or she would freeze to death halfway down. The math always wins. A hot, humiliating tear leaked out of the corner of her eye, instantly freezing on her cheek. She hated herself. She hated the weakness of her own muscles. She hated the logic that told her to stop trying. She pushed herself up and crawled over to his head. "I'm sorry, Tolliver," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." She reached down into the ruined, bloody mess of his collar. The flesh was ice-cold now, stiffening with the early onset of rigor mortis. She found the beaded metal chain of his dog tags. They were slick with frozen blood. She gripped the chain and yanked hard. It snapped with a dull pop. She wiped the tags on her pants, smearing the crimson into the fabric, and shoved them deep into her chest pocket, right over her heart. She didn't have a shovel. She couldn't bury him. Instead, she grabbed the torn, dust-covered camouflage netting they had used for the hide and dragged it over his body. She weighted the corners down with heavy rocks, working mechanically, refusing to look at his face again. It wasn't a hero's farewell. It was a transaction. She was trading his body for her survival. She picked up her M4 carbine, slung her lightened pack over her shoulders, and turned her back on the hide. The wind howled, erasing her footprints before she even took her third step down the mountain. The sky didn't just darken, it bruised. The pale grey of the afternoon bled into a deep, violently purple twilight, casting long, deceiving shadows across the jagged path. Riley moved like a machine with a failing battery. Every step required a conscious command from her brain. Lift the knee, plant the boot, test the rock, shift the weight. The goat path was a cruel joke of geology, a narrow shelf of limestone that hugged the sheer cliff face. To her left was solid rock. To her right, a 300-foot drop into the darkened valley. The wind screamed through the pass, treating her body like a sail, trying to peel her off the ledge. Her thighs burned with a deep, lactic acid fire. The cold had seeped deep into her joints, making her knees pop and grind with every downward step. Her lungs felt like they were lined with broken glass. The air at this altitude was too thin, offering no nourishment, only punishment. She kept her eyes locked on the ground directly in front of her boots. Looking down into the void induced a nauseating vertigo. Her mind was slipping. The adrenaline had completely burned off, leaving behind a profound, dangerous exhaustion. 14.2 mils up, her brain randomly supplied. Left 1.4. She shook her head, trying to clear the auditory hallucination. "Shut up," she muttered to the wind. She reached a switchback, a sharp turn where the path degraded into loose, icy scree. She planted her right boot. The rock simply wasn't there. Her foot blew out from under her. Gravity seized her instantly. Riley dropped, slamming hard onto her hip and sliding toward the edge. Panic, sharp and metallic, flared in her chest. She threw her hands out, her fingernails clawing uselessly at the frozen dirt and ice. She slid 2 feet, 3 feet. The edge of the cliff was right there, a ragged line of nothingness. Her left hand slammed into a jagged outcropping of limestone. She locked her fingers around it, the sharp edges slicing through her skin. Her momentum jerked to a violent halt. Her legs dangled off the side of the path, her boots kicking at empty air over a 300-foot drop. She hung there, gasping, her forehead pressed against the freezing dirt. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Pull!" she grunted, her voice a guttural animal sound. She engaged her shoulder, dragging her center of gravity back over solid ground. She heaved her torso over the ledge, collapsing flat on her stomach, her chest heaving, sucking in desperate, ragged breaths of the freezing air. She didn't get up immediately. She just lay there, letting the terror wash through her, feeling the cold seep into her bones. She wanted to sleep, just for 5 minutes. Closing her eyes felt like the most beautiful, luxurious idea in the world. No. She forced her eyes open. She pushed herself up to her hands and knees. She was a spotter. She calculated variables. If she stayed here, the variable was 0. 0% chance of survival. She crawled the rest of the way down the switchback, refusing to trust her legs. By the time she reached Secondary Point Alpha, a flat, exposed plateau jutting out over the lower valley, it was fully night. The darkness was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. She huddled behind a waist-high boulder, pulling her knees to her chest, shivering so violently her teeth clicked together in a rapid, staccato rhythm. She checked her watch. 58 minutes. She pulled an infrared strobe from her chest rig, flicked the toggle, and set it on the rock beside her. To the naked eye, it did nothing. Through night vision goggles, it would be a blinding beacon flashing against the dark mountain. Then she waited. The silence of the mountain was heavy. It gave her brain too much room to work. She kept seeing the pink mist of Lawson's head. She kept feeling the warm slip of Hutch's blood over her fingers. She kept hearing the terrible, wet sound of his dying breath. I should have grabbed the kestrel, she thought randomly. Hutch liked that kestrel. A low, rhythmic thumping vibrated through the rock before she heard it in the air. Thwack, 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 thwack. Riley lifted her head. A shadow detached itself from the darker mass of the sky. An MH-60 Black Hawk, running completely blacked out. No anti-collision lights, no navigation lights. It flared aggressively over the plateau, the massive rotors beating the air into submission. The downwash hit Riley like a physical blow. It kicked up a blinding storm of ice, dirt, and loose snow. She shielded her face with her arms, squinting through the debris. The helicopter didn't land. The terrain was too rough. It hovered 3 feet off the deck, the fuselage vibrating violently. The side door slid open. A crew chief, tethered to the ceiling, leaned out. He was wearing a flight helmet and panoramic night vision goggles. He waved his arm frantically. Go, go, go! Riley pushed herself off the boulder. Her legs were completely numb. She stumbled forward, leaning into the hurricane of the rotor wash. The smell of JP-8 aviation fuel and hot hydraulic fluid blasted her face. It was an ugly, industrial smell, but right now it was the greatest perfume she had ever breathed. She reached the skids. The crew chief grabbed the grab handle on her plate carrier, the exact same way she had tried to grab Hutch, and hauled her upward with practiced ease. She spilled onto the aluminum floor of the cabin, rolling onto her back. The helicopter instantly banked hard, diving away from the mountain, the engines whining as they pulled maximum torque. The sudden positive G-force pinned Riley to the deck. The crew chief knelt beside her. In the dim, green, ambient light of the cabin instrumentation, he looked young, too young. He lifted his visor, his eyes wide as he looked over her. He saw the blood. It was everywhere. It coated her hands, her forearms, smeared across her pants, caked into the fabric of her vest. "Are you hit?" he yelled over the deafening roar of the rotors and the wind tearing through the open door. "Medic! I need a medic!" Riley didn't answer. She just looked at him. "Where are you hit?" he demanded, grabbing her shoulder. "Where's the commander? Where's Vulture 1? Riley slowly sat up. The vibrations of the deck rattled through her spine. She looked at the young crew chief, seeing the frantic concern in his eyes. He hadn't been on the rock. He hadn't seen the math fail. She reached up with her stiff, brown-stained hands and unbuckled her helmet. She pulled it off, letting it drop to the floor. Her hair was matted with sweat and dirt. She didn't say a word. She just reached into her chest pocket, pulled out the blood-crusted dog tags, and pressed them into the crew chief's gloved hand. The young man stared at the metal tags, then looked back up at her, the frantic energy draining from his face, replaced by a sudden, heavy understanding. Riley leaned her head back against the canvas troop seat. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness of the cabin wash over her. The chopper tore through the night, carrying her away from the valley, but she knew the truth. She hadn't left the mountain. She was still up there, freezing in the dirt, waiting for the wind to change. The transition from the wild, freezing indifference of the Caucasus to the sterile, manicured reality of the forward operating base was a sensory assault. The MH-60's skids, hit the tarmac at Incirlik Air Base with a heavy, final thud that rattled Riley's teeth. The doors were already open. The air outside was 30 degrees warmer, heavy with the smell of scorched aviation fuel, damp asphalt, and the sickly sweet exhaust of diesel generators. A medical team was waiting, 3 people in blue scrubs and heavy fleece jackets, rushing the chopper with a folding litter. Riley ignored them. She unclipped her safety tether, her fingers moving with sluggish, mechanical precision. When the lead medic reached for her shoulder, she swatted his hand away. "I can walk," she rasped. Her throat felt like it was lined with rusted razor blades. She stood up. Her legs were numb blocks of wood, entirely devoid of sensation from the knees down, but she forced them to lock. She stepped out of the cabin, dropping the 3 feet to the tarmac. Her knees buckled instantly, slamming her hard onto the asphalt. The medic was there immediately, looping an arm under her armpit. "Gotcha. Easy, Chief. We've got you." She didn't fight him this time. She let him drag her toward the glaring white halogen lights of the triage tent. The inside of the medical tent smelled violently of bleach, iodine, and fresh canvas. It was a clean smell. It made Riley nauseous. They sat her on a paper-lined examination table. The crinkling sound of the paper beneath her thighs was deafening. Someone was cutting her plate carrier off. The sharp snipping of trauma shears biting into the heavy nylon webbing. She didn't try to stop them. She watched her chest rig, carrying her spare magazines, her radio, her trauma kit, hit the linoleum floor with a dull, heavy clatter. A nurse started scrubbing her hands with warm, soapy water. "Chief Boyd?" The nurse was young, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was scrubbing vigorously at the brown, flaky crust on Riley's knuckles. "Are you injured anywhere? Is this your blood?" "No," Riley said. Her voice was flat. "None of it is mine." The nurse paused for a fraction of a second, swallowing hard, before she resumed scrubbing. Before they could strip her out of her thermal top, the flap of the tent snapped open. Captain Miller stepped in. He wore neatly pressed desert fatigues, a heavy wool sweater, and a face that hadn't seen a field operation in a decade. He held a blue plastic folder. "Clear the room," Miller said. It wasn't a request. The medic and the nurse hesitated, looking from Riley's blood-stained hands to the captain. "Out," Miller barked. They dropped the sponges and left, the canvas flap zipping shut behind them. The sudden isolation in the bright, humming tent felt heavier than the dark on the mountain. Miller pulled up a metal folding chair and sat down opposite the exam table. He opened the folder. He didn't look at the blood on her shirt. He didn't look at the way she was shivering, the violent tremors racking her core as the heated air of the tent forced her frozen blood back into her extremities. Sat feed from the drone caught the tail end of the engagement, Miller began, his voice a measured bureaucratic drone. "We have visual confirmation. Lawson is dead. His security detail scattered. You burned the weapon?" "Thermite in the chamber," Riley said, staring at a stain on the linoleum floor. "Spiked the radio, dumped the optics." "And Commander Hutchinson? KIA, shrapnel to the carotid and pleural cavity, mortar strike." She recited it like a grocery list. "I secured his tags. I left him under the netting. Grid coordinate is in my wrist nav." Miller sighed, a slow, calculated sound. He tapped a pen against the blue folder. "The drone telemetry logged the distance of the kill shot, from your hide to the bridge." He stopped tapping. He finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. 2 miles, 3,500 yards. Riley said nothing. "The Barrett is rated for 2,000 yards on a perfect day with a tailwind, Boyd. You were in a cross-valley thermal sink. You didn't have a spotter." Miller leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. How did you make that shot? Riley slowly lifted her head. Her eyes felt sunken, bruised. She looked at Miller, seeing the clean fingernails, the lack of calluses, the absolute absence of the dirt and the mud and the void. He wanted a story. He wanted to write an after-action report about American exceptionalism, about a hero who defied physics to avenge her fallen commander. "I aimed high," Riley whispered. Miller frowned. "Don't get cute with me, Chief. Intel needs to know the exact—" "I aimed high," Riley repeated, her voice cracking, a sudden jagged edge of anger bleeding through the numbness. "I maxed the elevation turret. I held over in the glass. I guessed the wind. I guessed the spin drift. I pulled the trigger and prayed to a god I don't believe in that the bullet would hit the man who killed Hutch." She leaned forward, ignoring the burning pain in her thawing legs. "There was no magic, Captain. There was no math. It was luck. Blind, stupid, ugly luck. If I take that shot 1,000 more times, I miss 1,000 times. Lawson just happened to be standing where the bullet fell." Miller stared at her. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the portable heater in the corner of the tent. "The brass is going to want to spin this," Miller finally said, his voice dropping slightly. "A female SEAL. The longest confirmed sniper kill in naval history. It's a hell of a narrative, Boyd." Riley let out a short, broken sound that might have been a laugh. It sounded like tearing paper. "You tell the brass whatever you want," she said, sliding off the examination table. Her bare feet hit the cold floor. She swayed, grabbing the edge of the table to steady herself. "Write the report. Give me a medal. Put my face on a poster." She looked down at her hands. The nurse had only managed to clean the palms. The backs of her hands and her fingernails were still stained deep, rusty brown. "But if you ever put my name next to that shot in a press release," Riley said, looking back at Miller with dead, hollow eyes, "I will find you, and I will make you go up that mountain and bring Hutch home yourself. Are we clear?" Miller swallowed. He slowly closed the blue folder. "Get some sleep, Chief. You're confined to the transient barracks until debrief tomorrow." Riley walked past him without another word, her bare feet leaving faint, damp tracks on the clean linoleum. The transient officers' quarters was a shipping container retrofitted with drywall, a cheap mattress, and a stall shower. It was painfully bright, lit by a single, cage-covered LED bulb on the ceiling. Riley locked the metal door behind her. The deadbolt slid home with a solid, metallic clack. She stood in the center of the tiny room. The silence here wasn't like the silence on the mountain. The mountain's silence was vast, empty, capable of swallowing you whole. The silence in the container was claustrophobic. It pressed in on her eardrums, thick and suffocating. She moved to the sink. She reached into her chest pocket. Her fingers, still clumsy, found the cold metal of the dog tags. She pulled them out. The chain was stiff with dried blood. She set them on the edge of the porcelain sink. They clinked softly. Tolliver Hutchinson, Opos, Catholic. She stared at them for a long time. She waited for the tears to come back. She waited for the breakdown she had fought off on the mountain, for the grief to finally crack her open and let her bleed it out. Nothing happened. She felt completely hollowed out. A husk. The adrenaline had scoured her nervous system so thoroughly that there was nothing left to burn. She stripped. She peeled the thermal top off her skin. It stuck to the dried blood on her forearms, pulling at the fine hairs. She unlaced her heavy boots, her fingers aching as they manipulated the stiff nylon cords. Her pants were ruined, soaked through at the knees and the hips. She kicked them into a pile in the corner. She stepped into the tiny fiberglass shower stall and turned the dial all the way to hot. The water hit her back like a physical blow. It was scalding. It burned her half-frozen skin, sending a violent shockwave of pain through her nervous system. She gasped, bracing her hands against the cheap plastic wall, but she didn't turn the temperature down. She needed it to burn. She needed the pain to prove that she was still attached to her own body. The water cascaded over her shoulders, washing down her chest and arms. At first, it ran a pale, translucent pink as it hit the drain. Then, as the heat softened the dried blood caked into her pores, the water turned a dark, murky red. It swirled around her feet, pooling over the drain before disappearing into the plumbing. Riley grabbed a bar of standard-issue lye soap. It was rough, smelling strongly of industrial detergent. She scrubbed her arms. She scrubbed until her skin was raw and bright red, until the lather turned pink, until it finally rinsed clean. She took a stiff bristled nail brush and dug it under her fingernails, scraping away the dark crescent moons of Hutch's blood. The pain was sharp, biting. It felt right. But as the hot water hit the floor, the steam began to rise, filling the tiny stall, and with the steam came the smell. The hot water was reactivating the iron and the salt trapped in the dried blood. The tiny enclosed shower stall suddenly smelled exactly like the rock ledge. It smelled like torn meat, copper, and hot brass. Riley stopped scrubbing. The nail brush slipped from her fingers, clattering against the fiberglass floor. She closed her eyes, and she wasn't in the shower anymore. She was back on the shale, the pressure drop of the mortar, the deafening crack, the violent rush of air. Hutch's wide, glassy eyes staring at the grey sky, the wet, gurgling sound of his lungs filling with fluid. "I don't know the wind. I don't know the wind." A ragged, choking sob tore out of her throat. It wasn't a quiet, dignified cry. It was an ugly, animalistic sound, scraping against her vocal cords. She slid down the wall of the shower, pulling her knees tight against her chest, letting the scalding water beat against the back of her neck. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving as the dam finally broke. She cried for Hutch, for the wife and 3 kids in Coronado who didn't know their lives had ended 2 hours ago. She cried for the absurdity of the math, for the sheer, terrifying randomness of the universe that dictated a piece of shrapnel moved left instead of right. Mostly she cried because she knew the truth. Captain Miller was right. It was a hell of a narrative. The brass would sanitize it. They would take her ugly, desperate, spiteful act of survival and turn it into a recruiting poster. They would paint her as an avenging angel of the teams. They would never understand that the 3,500-yard shot wasn't a triumph. It was a failure. It was what happened when the plan disintegrated, when the math broke down, and when the only thing left to do was roll the dice in the dark. Riley sat on the floor of the shower until the hot water ran out, turning tepid, then freezing cold. She didn't move. She just let the cold wash over her, a familiar, numbing friend, settling deep into her bones where the blood couldn't reach. The debriefing room smelled of burnt coffee, floor wax, and ozone from the overhead projector. It was a windowless box deep inside the Tactical Operations Center, heavily air-conditioned to keep the server racks cool. Riley sat at the far end of a long faux wood conference table. She wore a clean, oversized grey sweatshirt and standard-issue tan trousers. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, wet knot. 3 men sat opposite her. Captain Miller, a naval intelligence officer named Hayes, and a civilian contractor who never offered his name. Only a firm handshake that felt like dry parchment. Hayes clicked a button on a remote, The projector hummed, throwing a stark black and white image against the wall. It was the drone feed. Thermal imaging. Timestamp is 1640 local, Hayes said, his voice carrying the practiced, smooth cadence of a man who presented PowerPoint slides for a living. On the screen, the valley looked like a topographical map drawn in ash. The bridge was a dark grey ribbon. The SUVs were bright, glowing rectangles of heat. Lawson and his men were shifting white silhouettes. Riley stared at the projection. Her stomach turned over, a slow, cold revolution. Up on the mountain, through the glass of the Barrett, the scene had been chaotic, blurred by dust and mirage, framed by the sheer terror of her own isolation. Up there, Lawson was a man in a tan coat. Here, from 20,000 feet in the sky, he was just a pixelated heat signature. It looked like a video game. It looked clean. "Right here," Hayes said, leaning forward, tapping the table with a pen. "Watch." Riley didn't want to watch. She locked her jaw. On the screen, the white blob that was Lawson stepped out of the vehicle. For 3 seconds, the scene was static. Then a sudden, blinding flash of white bloomed across the upper half of the silhouette. The thermal camera didn't register blood or bone. It only registered the violent transfer of kinetic energy and the sudden, rapid cooling of a life ending. The white blob fragmented, splattering against the hot rectangle of the SUV, then rapidly faded to grey as the ambient temperature claimed it. "Impact," the civilian contractor murmured. He sounded genuinely impressed. He sounded like he was admiring a golf swing. Hayes paused the video. The room went silent. "The telemetry on this is staggering, Chief," Hayes said, turning to look at her. 3,520 yards. Time of flight was approximately 7.8 seconds. The terminal velocity of the round was subsonic, yet you achieved a catastrophic impact on a target roughly 18 inches wide. "It was a headshot," the civilian added, raising an eyebrow. Riley looked away from the screen. She looked at the styrofoam coffee cup in front of her. She hadn't touched it. "We've run the variables through the ballistic computers back in Virginia," Captain Miller said, his tone less confrontational than the night before, replaced by a sort of quiet awe. Even with the Kestrel data and the localized wind models, the margin for error was less than 0.02%. A gust of wind down in the bowl, a drop in barometric pressure. Anything should have thrown that round 50 yards off target. "What's your point, Captain?" Riley asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of inflection. "The point, Chief," Hayes interrupted, "is that we need you to walk us through the dope. We need to understand the firing solution. How did you calculate the aerodynamic jump? How did you read the mirage without a spotter?" They leaned in, all 3 of them. They were hungry for it. They wanted the formula. They wanted to codify the miracle, turn it into data, put it into a manual so they could teach the next generation of snipers how to replicate the impossible. Riley looked at their clean hands, their pressed collars. She thought about the thud Hutch's body made when she tried to drag him. She thought about the hot, copper-scented steam in the shower. She could tell them the truth. She could tell them that the math broke down at 2,000 yards. She could tell them she maxed the turrets, closed her eyes for a split second, and pulled the trigger purely out of spite. She could tell them that she didn't read the mirage, she just guessed. But if she told them that, they wouldn't believe her. Or worse, they would write it off as a fluke, minimizing the only thing that had kept her from putting the barrel of her own sidearm in her mouth on that ridge. They needed a hero, and she needed them to stop asking questions so she could go back to her rack and stare at the ceiling. "Wind from the left on the ridge, 8 knots, Riley lied, her voice slipping into the clinical, rehearsed monotone of a briefing. "Thermal sink in the valley floor. Right to left funnel at the canyon, 12 knots. Spindrift was 1.2 mils right. Coriolis was negligible, but I factored .2 right. Hayes began writing furiously on a yellow legal pad. The elevation turret maxed at 30 mils, Riley continued, staring at the wall just above Miller's head. I held 18.6 in the reticle. Windage hold was left 4.2. And the trigger press? The civilian asked. Between heartbeats, Riley said. It was a textbook answer. It was what they wanted to hear. Her heart had been hammering at 160 beats a minute. There had been no between. Incredible, Miller breathed, leaning back in his chair. It's going to be in the books, Boyd. The brass is already drafting the commendation. Silver Star, at least. Maybe Navy Cross, given the circumstances of Commander Hutchinson's death and your solo exfil. I burned the rifle, Riley said abruptly. Miller blinked. We know. Standard operating procedure to deny the enemy the asset. You did the right thing. I burned the rifle, Riley repeated, her voice tightening. Because I couldn't carry Hutch. I traded 32 pounds of steel for 200 pounds of my commander. I left him in the dirt. The room grew uncomfortably still. The civilian cleared his throat and looked down at his shoes. Haas stopped writing. Chief, Miller said softly, stepping carefully into the emotional minefield. A QRF team recovered Commander Hutchinson's remains at 0600 this morning. He's in a transfer case at the airfield. He's going home. You did what you had to do. Riley stood up. The metal legs of her chair scraped violently against the linoleum. If we're done with the math, Riley said, her eyes locked on Miller. I'd like to be dismissed. Miller looked at her for a long moment, seeing the brittle, fragile edge just beneath the cold exterior. He nodded slowly. Dismissed, Chief. Your flight to Dover leaves in 4 hours. Riley walked out of the room. She didn't look at the screen as she passed. She didn't need to. The white blob, fragmenting in the dark, was already burned permanently into the back of her eyelids. Coronado, California, did not know how to be sad. The sun beat down on the Pacific with an aggressive, cheerful brilliance. The air smelled of salt spray, coconut sunscreen, and the exhaust of expensive sports cars cruising down Orange Avenue. It was 72 degrees. Perfect. It was always perfect. Riley stood at the edge of the surf, the water washing over her bare feet. She was wearing faded jeans and a plain grey t-shirt. The cold of the ocean was sharp, but it was a living cold. Not the dead, suffocating freeze of the Caucasus. She dug her toes into the wet sand. She was trying to ground herself. She was trying to feel the earth to prove that she was standing at sea level, thousands of miles away from the limestone shale. It had been 3 weeks since the shot. The military machine had moved with terrifying efficiency. Hutch had been buried at Fort Rosecrans with full honours. The volley of 3 rifle volleys had echoed across the manicured grass, the sharp crack of the blanks making Riley flinch so hard she had bitten her lip to draw blood, just to stay anchored in the present. She had stood in her dress blues, the wool scratching at her neck, and handed the folded flag to Hutch's wife, Sarah. Sarah hadn't cried during the ceremony. She had just looked at Riley with hollow, exhausted eyes, holding the heavy woolen triangle like it was a live grenade. He talked about you, Sarah had whispered at the reception, her voice trembling over a plastic cup of cheap wine. He said you were the only spotter he ever trusted to do the math right. Riley had excused herself, gone to the bathroom, and thrown up until her throat bled. Now, standing on the beach, the weight of the myth was suffocating her. The story had leaked. It always does. The teams are a small community. You can't keep a 3,500-yard kill shot quiet. The guys at the bar looked at her differently now. It wasn't the usual quiet respect for a female operator who had survived Bud/S. It was awe. It was reverence. They bought her drinks. They clapped her on the shoulder. They asked her, in hushed tones, how she calculated the spindrift at 2 miles. She had become a ghost story, the spotter who didn't need a scope, the angel of the Caucasus. She hated them for it. She hated them because their admiration forced her to carry the lie. Every time they praised her marksmanship, they were praising the moment her commander died. They were celebrating the ugliest, most desperate 10 seconds of her life. Riley reached into her pocket. Her fingers closed around the familiar, cold metal. She pulled Hutch's dog tags out. She had asked for a duplicate set from personnel, claiming hers were lost in the exfil. She hadn't given these to Sarah. These were the ones she had snapped off his neck in the dirt. They were clean now. She had boiled them, but in the sunlight, the stamped metal still looked bruised. She looked out at the horizon. The line where the blue of the ocean met the blue of the sky was perfectly sharp. No mirage, no thermal sink. Dial in 14.2 miles up, left 1.4. The numbers still looped in her head, a permanent ticker tape of useless data. She was a Tier 1 operator. She had spent her entire adult life mastering the physics of violence. She knew how to manipulate gravity, drag and velocity to put a piece of lead through a human skull. But out here, standing in the surf, none of it mattered. The math couldn't bring Hutch back. The math couldn't wash away the smell of the thermite or the sticky phantom warmth on her hands. The sniper rifle is a weapon of control. It allows you to reach out across impossible distances and impose your will upon the world. But Riley knew the secret now. She knew that control was an illusion. The wind does what it wants. The mortar falls where it falls. The bullet hits the target or it doesn't. You are just the spotter. You watch the tragedy unfold through a piece of high-end glass, and if you are very lucky or very cursed, you get to walk down the mountain alone. Riley wound the chain of the dog tags tightly around her right fist. The metal bit into her palm, a sharp, grounding pain. She turned her back on the ocean and began to walk up the beach, her wet footprints immediately filling with sand, erased by the wind before she even made it to the street. The silence after the shot isn't peace. It's the deafening weight of survival. If Riley's agonizing 3,500-yard gamble echoed in your chest, if you felt the freezing wind and the bitter reality of the mountains, don't leave her story here. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Your support helps us bring more gritty, grounded, and deeply human stories to life. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken the shot or walked away?